People assume that time is a strict progression of cause to effect, but actually, from a nonlinear, non subjective viewpoint, it's more like a big ball of wibbly wobbly, timey wimey stuff. This is the No Fear podcast. We know what scares you. I'm Matt.
I'm Mel.
And I'm Lisa. And this is the No Fear Cast, the podcast where we dissect horror and all the things that scare us. This is season 4, episode 9, and we are continuing our discussion of ghosts. So the opening introduction, probably any of you who are fans of Doctor Who will recognize that. That is a very well-known quotation from the show. It's from the episode Blink. And we're not actually talking about time travel exactly today, but we are continuing our discussion of ghosts. And in kind of looking at some of the different ghosts that have appeared in our favorite horror stories, we noticed that there were some interesting patterns when it came to time. I'm probably not doing a great job of explaining this, so I'm going to throw this to Mel because she is much smarter than I am when it comes to this kind of stuff. So, Mel, I know you have some really interesting ideas, or at least we've had some discussions in the past about ghost, really the idea of spectrality and kind of how that ties in with the past, the present, the future, and all this wibbly wobbly, timey wimey stuff.
Sure, yeah, I could talk a little bit about that. Part of the reason I chose the introduction from Doctor Who is I think I had mentioned this to you at some point, Lisa, that I feel like the idea of spectrality, which is this thing that academics talk about and people who do critical theory talk about, is kind of like a fancy term for basically what the Doctor talks about when he says that if you were looking at time from a nonlinear, non-subjective viewpoint, if you weren't taught to look at time as moving from, midnight to noon to midnight again, or past, present, and future, time would actually look like this huge ball of wibbly, wobbly, timey-wimey stuff. Because we have these concepts of time. That's one of the things that spectrality or theoreticians of spectrality talk about at its very basic level, I guess, is that time is always kind of unmoored. So we think because we have this construct of how time works, of 24 hours in a day and 365 days a year and things like that, those are just ways to categorize time so we can keep track of it and be in certain places at certain times. Even in I believe it was like in the early days of trains, time zones didn't really exist and no place even had the same time, really. They just had time for their particular town or city. And so that had to be fixed. So depending upon how your culture or the people around you are looking at time, it can be very different based on how we're experiencing it. So when I'm talking to my students about hauntings, one of the main things I tell them is that a haunting is when time is actually bending. And it's not that foreign to us, really, if you think about it. Like, while I'm talking to somebody in the present, I can be thinking about things that happened to me in the past that relate to what they're telling me. Or I could be thinking about how I'm going to go get lunch after we talk. Or I could be really nervous or scared about something that's coming up. Even in our minds, we can be thinking about almost multiple times at one time. And so, like, our experience of life is probably a lot more muddy than we like to think it is. And especially when you get into things like loss and grief and memory. And so I think one of the things that we talked about in our last episode was that ghosts kind of layer time. So like if I go to a haunted house and the place is haunted because something happened in the past, that's not necessarily my past, but I'm observing it or experiencing it because the past is forever happening, in that place, which is true. The past happened and maybe it affected the present, but a ghost just kind of makes that real. And then if a ghost is something in the past playing out in the present, it's probably going to continue into the future as well. And so, that's one of the things, if you're talking about like spectrality in particular, this idea of like time being unmoored or time being experienced or time being layered, is a really big aspect of that. And that's why I think that ghost stories and time travel stories are very much more similar than we like to give them credit for. Because if you're a time traveler, you're taken out of time, and the people around you could be interpreted as ghosts, and you could even be interpreted as a ghost. And so, people say like, oh, ghost stories and detective stories, that makes perfect sense. They fit together because violence and clues and yada yada. But if you look at time travel stories, or say multiverse or sci-fi stories, there is a little bit of ghostliness in there just because of the time aspect. So, if anybody is a fan of Doctor Who, you know that even in the classic Who, but especially now in the new Doctor Who, I could name like 3 to 4 episodes just off the top of my head that have actual ghosts in them. And the doctor always shows up and says, ghosts aren't real because I'm rational. I don't believe in that. And it turns out to be someone stuck out of time, or someone who's in the wrong time, or, someone who's trapped in this house and is only showing up every now and then when their pocket universe opens. There was even a Peter Capaldi episode where he said, okay, this is so ghostly, maybe ghosts are real. And so there's this not just genre bending between like detective fiction and the supernatural and other crime fiction and the supernatural, but I think there's also some slippage sometimes between science fiction and the supernatural just because of the way it bends time. I know, Lisa, you actually commented in our document that you had always thought of ghost stories and time travel stories as being very different, but in some of the stuff we were talking about discussing in this episode, I feel like from your note, you're starting to think of them as more similar than you did before.
Yeah, well, yes, because if you had asked me, it's like you said, I mean, detective fiction and ghost stories do seem to have always gone hand in hand. Or even this idea of like, if it's not a detective story, which this is even kind of a detective story, but like the ghost busting type genre that is so popular. And not just the movie Ghostbusters, but, I'm thinking of, when I see ghosts appear on television shows that I watch or in movies, like, okay, like the TV show Supernatural, which has been on now for forever. But they have ghosts on there quite a bit. And that show is so like ingrained in my own like TV watching culture and kind of horror culture now that if I see a ghost in something else, I'm just like, salt and burn, salt and burn. But I mean, that is even kind of, if you look at it, I would put something like Supernatural even more in the detective genre of, if we're looking at the greater genre of stories, because usually what are they doing? Well, they're out seeking something. They're following the clues. They're trying to do something. And if there is a ghost, as you said, when you were describing ghost being the past repeating itself, and it's going to continue repeating itself. And when you said that, I thought, well, unless somebody shows up and stops it.
True. Very true.
And that's always the idea in these kind of ghost stories. These like, I'm a detective / buster and I'm tracking down the ghost that's causing the problem. Usually what they have to figure out, and this is where the detective element comes into it, is they have to figure out, well, why is this ghost here? And usually it is unfinished business, right? Or a lesson that needs to be learned from the past. If you want to kind of put it in greater like scholarly, and by the way, this is a side note, but I'm just laughing over the idea of spectrality and the fact that scholars and academics can't talk about just ghosts and hauntings, and they have to call it spectrality in order to
and we could get even deper and be like talking about the always already and the paradox of ontology, and
right.
But we don't need to do that.
No, we're talking about ghosts and hauntings, real or imagined here. So that just makes me laugh. But it is that idea that if that is the past, that we have to learn our lesson from the past, or else it's going to continue on into our future. And so that's what those kind of stories always were. And then if you had told me, well, they're the same as time travel, I would have been like, no, not really. I mean, it's just no more than like leaving leftover fish in your fridge is a ghost. I mean, you can clean it out, but you're still going to smell it. You're going to have the spectrality of the fish in your fridge. That's not the same thing. And if you have a ghost, you have a remnant of the past. And so I was like, well, then that's not really the same thing. It's more of a specter of the past. I mean, it's a reminder of the past, but it's not the same thing as the past. But then when you started talking about Doctor Who and putting it into that world, all of a sudden something in my brain broke a little bit because I was like, oh, you're right. Because when you time travel, you're not necessarily traveling back to the past, because then are you actually doing that, or are you going back to a world full of ghosts who are no longer, are you the ghost? Are you, I mean, how are they viewing you in that case? And you know I don't know, like that changes it for me a lot. And I really want to explore this idea a bit more of how really ghost stories and kind of time travel stories, I mean, really are kind of the same thing. We're just talking about them from different angles,
Well,
I think.
I have a few conference papers I could share. But no, I think just how you just described it is like whether you went to the past or the future, there's like a ghostliness to it. And in the episode Hyde with Matt Smith and Jenna Coleman, he go in order to solve this haunted house mystery. It's a literal haunted house. They pull a lot of stuff from Haunting of Hill House. It's really interesting in that respect. Like a lot of the stuff that happens in Hill House happens in that house, but he wants to prove it's not a ghost. So he starts using all this like ghost hunting equipment because he's proving it with science, the doctor. And then he ends up, in order to figure it out, he goes to the beginning of Earth at that spot. And then he goes forward until the end of the earth, but always at that precise spot of that house, trying to figure out what happened. And I mean, that in itself is kind of one of the most ghostly things you can think of. But his companion, of course, realizes that in almost all those times, she either is dead or doesn't exist yet. And she says, if you're a ghost, if you're a time traveler, everybody else is ghost to you. Like, how do you even create a relationship with other people? Because their lives are like a snap, compared to what you're experiencing. And you have that, but you also have the paradox of it too. I mean, a ghost is a paradox. It's something that you see the first time ever, but it's a returning thing. And it keeps happening the first time to other people, but it's always something that's returning at the same time. And time travel is kind of the same way. Like, if I take myself out of time and I go somewhere else, I'm creating a paradox. I'm really creating a paradox if I exist in the time that I'm traveling to. So, yeah, I mean, I get in some ways it's probably not as horrifying as we should probably be with a horror podcast, but I think it also calls up some of that existential dread that we talked about last time, because if you pull back and you look at the kind of slipperiness of time that ghosts have, or that time traveler narratives have, it could be really overwhelming, I think, if you look at time in that way.
I'm so glad that you used the phrase paradox when describing ghosts and excuse me, when describing ghosts and their presence or whatnot, because like the space nerd in me is constantly we're talking about time travel as well as ghosts, and I'm trying to like reconcile like physics with all of this. And granted, I'm not a physicist, I don't have the mathematical background to do it, so my conception of it is fairly loose, but like I keep coming back to that idea of like fluidity of time, as you were saying, being much, I mean, that's what Einstein was talking about with gravity affecting time, that time is actually not something that is a singular thing, but it can be affected by gravity. And the good pop culture example would be the movie Interstellar. The closer they get to the black hole, the longer their perception of time, or the amount of time that passes compared to their perception of it is different. And so I just keep trying to kind of reconcile that with this idea of ghosts, and maybe it's somebody that fell in a black hole, that sort of thing. But really, that's always the the side of things that I've always loved is that idea of like how time travel could work in a practical, actual sense. But if you do believe in ghosts, then I mean, it is an odd sort of form of time travel, like you were just saying, and I the fact that you use the word paradox, it just kind of like triggered all these thoughts in my head. But also, it's just I had not thought of it in that from that perspective before of a ghost as a paradox. But you're absolutely right, and I really like that. So that was a very long-winded way of saying, "Wow, physics is cool." I really like what you said, Mel.
Thank you. Yeah, I wish I understood more about physics too, because I think it definitely. I mean, I think what you're saying about the fluidity of time definitely relates, like with Interstellar and other stories about folks' experience of time while they're time traveling, or the multiverse too. Like, I mean, if there are multiple universes where versions of us are doing things, if they ever interconnected, or someone came from another one and was in yours, I mean, that is in a way a type of haunting or a type of paradox in and of itself. Of course, this is all like science fiction. I mean, there's a layer of truth and science to it, but fiction takes it in other directions.
Well, that brings up the idea too of what it. I mean, we probably can't dwell on this for too long, but just the idea of what is a ghost, because if we're talking about, for instance, like a time travel, from a time travel perspective, see this this is where it gets me.
Well, Lisa, think about that. Think about the movie Primer, where the guys basically become ghosts of themselves and are not really able to interact with the timeline in the way that they had before. For those of you that haven't seen Primer, stop what you're doing and go watch it. It's like an hour. It's amazing.
But they kind of definitely ghostly. Yeah.
They kind of become these sort of ghost characters. It's hard to describe without those of you that have seen it, but I know.
Well, yeah, I mean, but that's the thing. Like, I keep like, I keep wanting to say something about like what is a ghost, but now I've pulled at that string so long in my brain that it's completely unwound itself now. Because when we were talking about this on the previous episode, like a ghost is a dead person, right? Like, okay, somebody who lived their life in a linear way and then has passed away. But then as we're talking about it now, it's kind of like, okay, well, if you have a time traveler, if they go beyond their birth, before their birth or after their death in the normal kind of linear time, then technically they're not alive, so they are ghostly and they're certainly perceived as ghosts or Mel, like, yeah, when you were talking about other dimensions and maybe when that crosses over and how you can kind of be haunted by yourself or you're in a place. I don't know. It's just, I don't know. Cause now I felt like when we ended last episode, I was very clear on what a ghost was. And even when we started this one, I was like, well, the ghosts are the things that the Winchester brothers hunt. And now I don't know anymore.
Oh man. And if you look up ghost and like the OED or whatever, they're just as confused because like what a ghost has been is, it changes. Cause I mean, it could be a dead person, but then you have the whole religious argument that over the course of decades changes. Like, if you believe in body, spirit, and soul, so you have a body that decomposes and spirit that goes off and does things, and a soul that ultimately is like your being, I guess, so it'd be in the afterlife. And then other people are just like spirit or it's a remnant of you. And other people think it's like an image of something that happened that replays. Now we think of it more like related to, I think we think more of it related to technology now because that's kind of like what we're thinking about or what we're worried about. Well, even the Japanese horror movie, Lisa, that you and I watched, Cairo, the ghosts were in the computers at one point. Like they were making websites to trick people into coming and becoming ghosts. I wonder, I think it has something to do with whatever like the beliefs or what's going on in the society at the time. That's kind of what the ghosts start to become.
Mel, you're hurting my brain.
Time travel is hard on the brain. So one of the things that you said I thought was really interesting considering the one movie we're for sure going to talk about and maybe the other one that we'll get to the idea of living your life chronologically, but then dying, like, I was thinking to myself while you were talking, is like, okay, if I live my life chronologically and then I die, like, you don't have like a wristwatch as a ghost, right? Like, I mean, I feel like as a ghost, you would just be completely disconnected from time in a way that you weren't when you were a physically embodied person or an alive person.
Yeah, well, I mean, and that kind of runs the thing where we're if I can't even form sentences now. Uh, if we are mashing subgenres here of horror and kind of sci-fi and speculative fiction, because this does cover a lot of it, is the idea of immortality, which we've talked about a little bit when we talked about like vampires and that sort of thing. But at least a vampire or another eternal creature still has somewhat of like a human body and can interact with humans in a different way. If we're taking and this again, we're having to kind of narrow down our definition of what a ghost is, but if we're looking at some of these stories where a ghost is a person who has ceased, who did live their life and then has ceased to live, but now has either retained all of their personality or at least some of their sentience. You know, some of their, maybe they don't even fully know what they are or who they are, but they maintain some. In other words, it's not just like a video recording flashing back. Which I know some people would speculate when they talk about like real life hauntings that maybe it's just like a time loop repeating itself. But if we're talking about actually like now we have like an entity, or I don't know if you want to call it like a soul or a spirit or whatever, because that's something important to talk about is once you gain that like immortality where you can't really die, because I guess in this case you're already dead, you do experience time differently. And that's good. That goes back, loops back to the idea of the time traveler too, because if you can time travel, I guess, forever and see something from the beginning of time to the end of time, then you're not going to be able to, number one, you're going to view time differently and probably lose all real sense of it, you know, any anchor to it. Because one thing I've noticed just as a human being who is alive, you know, the older you get, you do start to be aware that your time is limited. I mean, that taps into that uncomfortableness of the existential dread that we talked about, but it also kind of prioritizes things and makes you look at things differently. I think if we did not have that, if we took that away and we were like, no, we're immortal beings, it would change the way a lot of us interact with the world and with people around us if we thought that we had infinite time. And so I think that is one of the kind of practical ways that if you're looking at the way a ghost character functions in a story or in a movie, that is one of the very practical ways that it can become unmoored or untethered to any sense of time very quickly. That also kind of goes back, Matt, to what you're talking about with like the black hole type of thing, right? It's in how you experience it differently. Does that make sense at all?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, if
Yeah, I think so.
I'm sorry, I was just pondering like how much time I might have left, and I was just
I shouldn't have introduced that because now everybody's like, oh my gosh.
and depressed.
All the listeners just like stopped listening at this point and they're like, what am I doing with my life?
Back to the existential dread.
Maybe we should apologize to listeners for making them really depressed with this one.
I know. Well, just wait till you see what we got in store for you with this episode, because we're really gonna drive it home.
It's gonna get remarkably darker. Yeah, I mean, and even if you think of the traditional way we think of a ghost, like it's tied to a place. So, like if the traditional way we think of a ghost is that someone who's passed away who may or may not be, not a lot of times talk about existential dread. You have fiction where ghosts all of a sudden realize they're a ghost, and that's pretty horrifying. Like, oh my gosh, I'm dead, I'm still around. Like, what the heck does this mean? But if you're a traditional ghost, you live a chronological life, you pass away, now you're unstuck in time. You're probably going to be tied to something, so like a person or a place. And that in itself is kind of a horror when you think about it, because you could be stuck to a particular place for years and years and years and years, and your experience of time is completely different than everybody's around you. I don't know. I mean, I feel like you would almost have this like, oh, what's the word I'm looking for? Like obsessional connection to whatever place or person you are still attaching to, because your experience of time and life would be completely different to there. Like the person you left behind or the place you left behind is going to change, but you're never going to change. You're just going to sit there. And so,
And that's going to happen very quickly for you.
right. Yeah. Wherever you're stuck. Yeah.
Yeah, so we should just go ahead and talk about a couple of the movies that we mentioned, because I really want to talk about this one. And that I feel like we're talking around it a whole lot, and that's the movie A Ghost Story, which came out in 2017, and it stars Casey Affleck and Rooney Mara. And if listeners, if you did not watch it, we're not going to spoil anything because there's nothing really to spoil in this movie. It's kind of it's in the way you watch it, I think is the best way of describing it, because all you need to know is that Casey Affleck dies and he comes back as a ghost, and he's that literal ghost. He's shown in the movie as a sheet with holes cut out, like a white sheet with the holes cut out, like full on Charlie Brown Halloween special. It's the Great Pumpkin, Charlie Brown. That's what he looks like. And it would seem ridiculous, except this movie, like when I watched it, it was like a gut punch. And I was like, I have to talk about this movie with somebody. And I knew we were talking about ghosts coming up. And so I don't know. I really, because this I think exemplifies exactly what we're talking about in seeing how just number one is a really good portrait of grief, but also this idea of spectrality and time and everything, the wibbly wobbly timey-wimey stuff that we've been talking about. This shows it so succinctly and so beautifully and so like heartbreakingly. It's amazing. I should also go ahead and say it's an A24 movie. So for those of you horror fans out there, you'll probably recognize A24. They've done a lot of really cool stuff. Ari Aster's stuff has been done, produced by them. And yeah, so far I have not seen a bad film that they've put out. Anyway, Mel, I'm hoping you have some thoughts on this movie.
Yeah, I do. I have a lot of thoughts, but I'm afraid I might not be able to. I don't know. It kind of breaks your mind when you're watching it. It's funny. I had seen this probably like sometime in 2018. I can't remember if I saw when I was reading something or if I just saw in passing on Netflix. And I was like, oh, I think I'd be interested in that movie. I'd like to watch it. And then, of course, I put it off and put it off and put it off. So when you mentioned, Lisa, that you had watched it and wanted to talk about it for this episode, I watched it. And I think I texted you the day after I watched it and said that, I it's hard to say like how I even feel about the film. I feel like it's a good film. I know a lot of people didn't like it because it's very slow and not a lot happens. But I think that's because he's trying to show different conceptions of time and grief. But it's like, I think I said to you, it got in my head.
Yes.
I couldn't stop thinking about it. And yeah, even when it ended, I was just kind of sitting there like, whoa, because yeah, you're right. I mean, all this stuff that I had read about ghosts or written about ghosts in time was just like there on the screen. I found the interpretation of how the ghosts work to be really fascinating.
Yeah.
I had to watch it again and I'm still just like, I don't know. It just gets in your mind.
That's the kind of movie it warrants a second and probably even a third viewing. And you're right, not much happens. Like there's not much plot. There's not much dialogue. There's a lot of scenes that go on for an uncomfortably long time. But then they'll be followed with something happening, but happening very quickly, and then kind of moving back into that like slow, nothing's really happening. And I think that adds to the unsettlingness of it, because it's a movie that deals with time and deals with the concept of time. And it makes you feel time, if that makes sense at all, when you're watching it. Like, it was one of those movies that I hesitate to say it's like an art movie, but it kind of is, because I kind of roll my eyes at that term a lot. But it produces a very visceral reaction, and it does haunt you afterwards. I will say A24, because this is pertinent to our podcast since we are a horror podcast, but this is why we wanted to talk about ghosts separate from a ghost story or like a haunting story, because a ghost really is something that's separate. And this is what A24 had to say about the movie. They said, PSA, a ghost story is not a horror movie. It is not a post horror movie. It is a cosmic love story about time and the enormity of our existence. That's essentially the plot of the movie, like boiled down to one tweet. It is not a horror movie. And there are things that are hard to watch in the movie, and there are things that are borderline scary. You know, there were some creepy moments, but it's definitely not a horror film. So it's a story that has a ghost as a protagonist that is not a horror movie, which is pretty unusual. But at its core, it really is about time and the enormity of our existence. And I think that is what is so fascinating too, is to watch what happens, as you said, Mel, if we take this idea of that a ghost has to be tethered to something, whether that's a place or a person, and then what happens when that place or person no longer exists. Oh, it's so good.
One of the other things it does, and this might be a spoiler, but I'm going to go ahead and talk about it. So if listeners, if you feel like you're worried, just pause and go watch a ghost story on Amazon Prime.
But I will go ahead and say that you cannot spoil this movie, I don't think.
Okay.
Even if you knew every single thing that happened.
One of the things that I thought was really fascinating about the movie, and I think I'm just now getting to the point where I can kind of articulate it a little bit, is everything you were saying. And we need to talk about that, like the way it represents time. But the other thing I thought was really interesting was the enormity of our existence part, is the fact that this is really dark. And I'm sorry, listeners, but it shows how we are haunted by everything that leads up to us, because it starts out with two people talking about like all the houses that they've lived in, and it ends in this amazing paradox. When I got to the end of the movie, I was like, oh my gosh, that is so amazing, because that is exactly what a haunting is. The character is haunted by his death, like his entire life, which we are, right? Like like our death is always kind of there, because from the moment we're born, the idea that our lives could end is there. I mean, we live a constant paradox because we're living, but our potential for dying is always there. And at the end of the movie, when you realize that the weird shimmery thing, he was looking at the wall while he was holding her on the couch and they were talking about all the houses she lived in, was actually him, like dead. I was just like, oh my gosh, my brain hurts. Number one. But two, it doesn't make sense fully because it's a paradox, right? But like his death was always going to happen. And the weird lights and whatnot that they saw at the beginning of the movie, and the noise on the piano, like, and at the end of the movie, his ghost is haunted by his own ghost, and the layers and layers and layers of possibility just go on and on and on. And I was like, that is the perfect representation, because there are no answers at all. And it's just layers of ambiguity.
And that, I think, is one thing that both frustrated me about this movie and that I loved, is that it absolutely refuses to answer things. And I think you're right. I think that's what hits the nail on the head of this idea. And again, we're going to get dark because this is a dark movie. But that's the thing, is that really, when you look at somebody's life, the only thing that is certain is that we're going to die. Like, that is the one certainty everybody's given. And everything else is just a whole lot of questions that, for a large part, are unanswered. You know, there's a lot of guessing in life and a lot of confusion and a lot of that. But then there was also, when it does show the living part, and you see the human connection, and you see what it means when that human connection is broken, and you see the power that humans have through creativity, even something that just by its nature won't last, there was also a lot of like beauty buried in there too. I don't know if I've ever ever seen a movie that I thought, wow, this not only did they crawl into the head of some scholar who's written too much on spectrality. Because that could have been somebody's that probably is somebody's dissertation.
Yeah, that movie is
But
gonna be someone's dissertation in just a couple years. Just give it time.
yeah. But I mean, I thought it also held so much beauty in there, and it did show because I mean, life isn't darkness. You know what I mean? Not all the
Mhm.
time. And even though that, like, as we said, that kind of existential dread of knowing that eventually our time on Earth will like come to an end, but there's a whole lot of like beauty and creativity and connection and human relationships and heart that's shoved into there, and that maybe is that shortened time period that heightens it and makes it mean something. That's what is essentially connecting him there, because that's the other thing that we haven't talked about in this movie that really kills me. So basically it's a man and his wife. You're kind of following them shortly until he dies and he becomes the sheeted ghost character. But when she leaves the house, when she moves away, she writes something and she sticks it in the wall of the home. And he sits there as a ghost trying to get to that message in a really kind of, again, heart achingly beautiful way, trying to get at that. And to me, that was like a highlight of, well, that's what is tethering him there. Is it's not the place, and not necessarily that I think they had this like great love, because I think it tried to show that they were just a normal couple, but that did mean something that went beyond. I don't know. There was a lot of beauty in that movie too. It's difficult to talk. It's a difficult to talk about movie.
It is. Yeah. And while you were talking, I was thinking of a couple different things, but one was, yeah, the slip of paper was amazing that, he's staying there for that. But how was I going to say? It's difficult to talk about because even when you have an idea about it in your mind, it's difficult to articulate what was going on. But part of the problem with their relationship that they fixed to a certain extent before he died, but also probably could have been leading to some of the grief between the two as well, was that she wanted to leave the house because she didn't really like it. It's old and falling apart. They actually filmed it in a house that was going to be torn down so that, the house is torn down because time changes while he's in the house even. She's like, this place is old. I don't want to live here anymore. But he wants to live there because he said they have history there. And so he's like tied to the place and she's not. She moved all her life. He loves this place and wants to stay there. And in a way, that even becomes almost like a conflict between them after he's dead, because when he leaves the hospital, a door opens up in front of him, which we assume could take him to another level or whatever. Like he doesn't have any more unfinished business. Goodbye. But he just ignores it and he walks as a sheeted figure for miles and miles and miles until he gets to that house. And it's almost like he carries this obsession with that place where they were together forever until, remember, he tries to kill himself as a ghost. And then he starts over at the beginning of time. And then
Right.
he hears himself say, yes, we can move. I'm okay with it. And then then he has like ghost angst and depression for a while where he just sits at the piano and is like, what have I been doing? Like all this time. And then the other thing I thought was interesting was the portrayal of grief on both sides, because after he dies, we're seeing things kind of from his perspective. And so you have those beautiful moments where she doesn't want to sleep in the bed, but she falls asleep anyway. And he, as the ghost, is trying to touch her, but she doesn't even know he's there. And then the other one is when she's listening to the song that he wrote when they were fighting or whatever. And she's lying on the floor listening to the song and he's right there. And she reaches out, not even knowing he's right there. And her hand is like touching the sheet, but she doesn't know he's there. And that was like that would like rip your heart out, because that is like the most real portrait, I think, of loss of another person that you can see in a movie. And the dead person is feeling it too, because he doesn't know
Right.
what to do now. And then, of course, he becomes a poltergeist because he gets angry. He gets angry when she tries to create a new relationship, and he gets angry when she decides to move. He gets angry when new people move in the house because they're not her or whatever. I feel like he starts to forget precisely what he's after the hundreds almost of years that he's on this place, which in itself is terrifying to look at it from his perspective.
Well, that goes into the crosses over into the idea of the time traveler too, because once you realize that time is changing and place is changing, but you're not changing. I mean, that would be enough to drive anybody nutty and crazy. I mean, like I think about that movie, and I know we had talked about this a little bit, but the movie The Others
Mhm.
fits that really well. This idea that not understanding what the changes are that are happening around you, because you are essentially, I guess when you look at it as a ghost, as a time traveler, is a lot of times the ghost becomes tied to a specific moment in time and a specific place in time that doesn't exist anymore.
The past trying to reassert itself, even
Right.
though what was there is gone. Yeah, that's an
And
interesting
it
way to
has
look
it
at
has
it.
that same I liked The Others. I like A Ghost Story better, but The Others has that same idea of obsession too, of obsession with trying to reclaim something that once was there but does not exist anymore.
Well, and the others also has like a level of trauma and denial too, because the main character, the Nicole Kidman character, is in denial that she actually. Okay, spoiler, listeners.
You can't spoil a movie that was what, 18 years ago? Come on.
uh,
We're going
but
on 2 decades here.
she doesn't want to face the fact that she killed the children, and the children don't want to really face the fact fully that she killed them. And so you also have this idea of like they've been made ghosts because of the trauma that they experience, which they're all ghosts because of that. The husband is a ghost because of the trauma he experienced at war, and the servants are ghosts because of the trauma they experienced during the tuberculosis scare. And so, yeah, I mean, they don't even know they're ghosts because it's just like they don't want to face the horrible thing that happened to them. And another thing I thought was interesting about the others, because I recently listened to the Switchblade Sisters podcast episode on the others. And so I went back and watched the others, which thank you, Lisa, for introducing me to that
Oh,
podcast.
I just want to say I love the Switchblade Sisters podcast. So if y'all are looking for more podcasts to listen to and you're not listening to that one, it's so good.
Yeah, check it out. I've listened to a few episodes now, they're great. But I rewatched the others, and one of the things I thought about this time was how even in the house, all the ghosts are of different time periods. So yet again, it's not chronological because we know the father died a while ago, and yet he's still wandering around tied to the battlefield. And the mom and the kids are of their time after he was killed and she lost it because she didn't have her family and she was alone. And then the servants are from like the 1800s or something. So, and they're just basically like, now we all have to learn how to, be together. Like they're literally just starting up housekeeping as a bunch of ghosts from different periods. But I thought that was interesting because it's almost like multiple hauntings are happening in this one place. It's like the haunting from the 19th century and the haunting from the early 20th century. And then the people who are much later are being haunted by them. It was interesting to me because the first time I watched the first few times I watched the others, because I've used it in class before, I think more about like, the idea of like trauma and denial and the mother and the child relationship and that sort of thing, and comparing it to other ghost narratives. But this time I was like, man, even there, the house is like a nexus of time, because it doesn't matter that they all live so far apart from each other in age and whatever. They're all dead now. And they're going to like continue to be that way and try to hang on to that house, which is very much like, the movie A Ghost Story until he's finally released from the house. Well, thinking of layered time in one place makes me think of another writer that Lisa and I are both fans of, and that's Tanana Reeve Dew. And she's probably best known for her novel, The Good House, but she has a novella, Ghost Summer, that I believe came out in 2008, but it is collected in her 2015 short story collection of the same name, listeners. So I highly recommend using that short story collection. I just taught it for the first time, or at least some of the sections, some of the stories in it. But the novella Ghost Summer, it goes back to the occult detective fiction aspect that we talked about and Lisa mentioned at the beginning of this episode, because you have a child, this boy, and he wants to be a ghost hunter. He wants to get video of ghosts that he can put on YouTube. And so he wants to visit his father's parents, his grandparents, because they live in this place, Gracetown, Florida, where children see ghosts regularly. So if you read the story collection, you'll get all sorts of stories about ghosts that children see. And they're an African-American family, and they live in Gracetown, where there's been a lot of racial violence throughout the history of the town, going back to slavery, but also during the civil rights movement and beyond. And sometimes the ghosts attached to that history. And so this child who's just trying to find video of a ghost to put on YouTube ends up in this haunting with his sister and his father that I won't go all the way to the end, obviously, because I don't want to completely spoil the story. But they're not friendly ghosts that kind of like go through you and just give a cold spot. Like they actually feel the water of the swamp that these children were running through when they were being chased. There's a ghost dog, and they're actually injured by the ghosts, and they have scars from this experience. And, I think one of the really interesting things that's going on in this novella is doing exactly what we've been talking about. You have a present day family that is literally getting sucked into the past. Like, it's not quite like time travel per se, but they're not just observing the ghosts. They're literally running through the woods, through water that the children could drown in, being chased and in the same peril as these three children. And they end up in some way learning about the history of the town, but they're also very affected by this, of course. And so I think it shows like the realness of the past, the fact that we can't always know what happened in the past, but it's very real and it affects us just by literally having them almost fall into the past or cross over, as the boy calls it. I recommend reading it. It's a very interesting way of representing the past and how dangerous it can be. And it reminds me a little bit of what we talked about with Beloved, the idea that past can be so violent that it actually like injures people or marks people in some way.
I'm so glad you said that, Mel, because I'm always looking for excuses to recommend Tananarive Due to people. um, so yeah, Ghost Summer, I think that fits really well into the idea of how time is layered, but also as I'm learning how genres are layered, because that you're exactly right. That is, I mean, that's detective fiction, supernatural, spectrality, and time travel kind of all in one really cool story. So yeah, y'all go read Tananarive Due. If you are looking for more things to read, as we're recording this, we're recording this on December 5th, which means the holidays are coming up and everybody's going crazy shopping. Definitely buy the book lover in your life Tananarive Due. Maybe buy a ghost story for the film buff in your life. But we also wanted to tell you that if you go over to the Quirk Books website, which I think is quirkbooks.biz, they have a holiday pop-up shop online now through December 16th. And they have several of their books there that they have all kind of boxed up. But they actually have a Monster She Wrote box. So you can get Mel and I's book, Monster She Wrote. In the box, it comes with a copy of the book, a bookmark. There's a super cool little like pen that's shaped like a bone, and then some other fun goodies. There's some candy and stuff in there, so it's a really fun little box, and it comes perfectly like already boxed up. So all you have to do is wrap it and slap a bow on it, and your shopping is done. So I just thought I would throw that idea out there. I always recommend buying books for people because I think that's a wonderful gift, whether it's Monster She Wrote or Tananarive Due, or whoever you're really into reading right now. But as always, we will be back next time. But until then, we would love to hear from you. We're at No Fear Cast on Twitter and Instagram, and we also have a Facebook page. If you'd like to contact us by email, and we check our emails and we just love hearing from y'all, is at nofearcast@gmail.com. If you want to show us some love, consider supporting us on Patreon. If you do that, you'll get access to exclusive content, including many episodes in the weeks that our regular episodes are off. So you'll get all of that backlist. Or if you don't, maybe because it is the holiday season and money may be tight, we completely understand that. You can just rate and review us. which is entirely free, and it does help other listeners find us. And of course, we would love some good word of mouth love too. As always, thank you so much for listening. We will be back in 2 weeks with a brand new episode and to continue our discussion of ghosts.